Hello guys, how are you all? Welcome back to my channel. So, today we are gonna see, what if Deku was slave and gets one for all, movie. So before we start, go check out the author of this fanfic, Noe.sen94, link is in the description, also subscribe to our channel, and like this video. So let's begin the video. Deku. A scream and a powerful explosion threw Izuku Midoriya into the wall. Once again, guard Bakugo's head literally exploded, finding Midoriya and all to help an old man who couldn't carry his pick and shovel. Dead up trash, a deep scream echoed in the mine. Behind Bakugo was the foreman and guard leader Killer Croc, a guy with the appearance of a reptilian humanoid. Bakugo smiled and Midoriya could see that madness and killer instinct in her eyes that so characterized the explosive boy. You already heard the boss garbage without singularity. Get back to work. Midoriya trembled in front of Bakugo and refused to look at him, even though they were both of the same age and practically from the same place. There was a very big barrier between them. Bakugo was a guard of the Empire with the singularity to blow things up, while Midoriya was a non-singularity person. In a world of surprising abilities, where superheroes and supervillains were reality, Izuku Midoriya was a normal person. But difficulty, pain, and burning in many parts of his body, Midoriya stood up, passed with his gaze downcast to the side of Bakugo, who was smiling arrogantly, and headed towards the Kankori mines, where he was forced, with many other people, to extract the material for the Emperor's factories. Midoriya was 14 years old, born in Japan in the era of superhumans, people with unique abilities and powers. The singular constitution, as it was called at the beginning, was the possibility of making dreams come true, of making the world have real heroes. Heroes who protected people from natural and human evils, or at least that's what she wanted at first. 4 years before Midoriya was born, a powerful villain conquered Japan and Asia. He formed a new empire nation and over time separated the people by their abilities. Midoriya, who was unlucky enough to be born without a singularity, was condemned to be a slave in a world conquered by all for one. However, in a world where good exists, evil must also exist. With the birth of heroes, villains also came and, as in comics and movies, the streets were filled with super fights. Good and bad men fought for their ideals, flags of virtue, and human decadence were raised everywhere and gave way to legends and stories that in the future would inspire new heroes and villains. As time passed, the singularities became normal, the laws accepted the heroes and looked for a way to punish evil. Then when the world seemed to be guided by heroes and peace, the Emperor appeared, or, as the history books would know him for eternity, the possessor of the most powerful singularity, the All-for-One, a man capable of taking the powers from others. The only person with God's power to grant and remove the singularity. Operating for years in the shadows, always with different names and powers, All-for-One formed an army, and in the same era that the world met the most powerful hero that ever existed, the legendary All Might. The world also met the greatest evil, a man who would become emperor and who would enslave Asia. The powerful All-for-One and All Might joined many heroes and villains in the most epic battle in history, a battle that lasted 7 days and 7 nights and ended with the victory of the villains. Tokyo Sunset, as it became known, was the fall of heroes and the rise of evil. With All Might defeated and missing in action, the Emperor and his group of villains took control of Tokyo. The city had suffered 30% damage in the battle, with no human losses, but with endless debris. That fateful day, Tokyo was only the first city conquered. In 1 month Japan had fallen before the Emperor. In 6 months the kingdom of All-for-One already covered most of Asia. The world was afraid. Who would face it? All nations had their eyes on the Emperor's movements, and after the conquest of China, at the beginning of the invasion of Russia, it was announced, as an act of benevolence, that the advance of All-for-One would be stopped there. That the world understood the power of the Emperor was his only goal. And that was the Japan in which Izuku Midoriya was born, in a place controlled by villains. At first people thought it would only be temporary. That someone would appear and save them, but that savior never came. Soon the All-for-One dictatorship separated society. Rich people could remain in the upper class as long as they swore loyalty and obeyed the Emperor. Anyone with a powerful singularity that served to maintain control of the power of the villains also rose to power. In the middle class those with supporting singularities remained, and in the lowest class all people with useless singularities, and of course without singularity. This class was soon taken to work in places in Japan that until then were unknown. The Kankori mines. A material until recently unknown and that was supposed to have no value. However, it was not so. Since Kankori is super refined, does an increase in the limits of singularity. Soon not only had All-for-One conquered a territory by force, but the Emperor created the drug that everyone wanted and attacked the world's economy. The countries changed the way they saw the nation. All-for-One, they accepted the Emperor as a friend and turned their backs on the people conquered by the villains. All because of the new miraculous power of Kankotri. The countries of the world changed. The balance of power suffered an imbalance. Japan was only the first, but very soon other countries broke out in wars, power, and class disputes, plunging a world of peace made by heroes into a world of chaos made by a villain and his power. A world where fear soon reigned, where hope was lost, and where the heroes became fugitives from the law or, as they were also called, the resistance. Midoriya pushed the cargo cart on the rails to take it out of the mine. It had been a day that was too long and not very fruitful. Work Team 13, to which Midoriya belonged, had taken out very little ancori. Surely Killer Croc, who was the foreman of teams 10 to 20, would reduce their food rations. Izuku sighed. The work was hard. He did not understand how the kankori, that material that he had to extract every day, had been discovered after so many years and in so many quantities. When he was still little and lived with his mother, he remembered that a scientist had said that just as people change to develop singularities, the Earth was changing like him in a way similar to man. However, only Asia produced this rare material. Only the territory of All for One, as they once called the Emperor's domain, was the producer of the super enhancement drug. Midoriya finally came out of the dark mine, and although the light blinded him a little, he soon realized that he was in a wide circle dug into the earth, with multiple entrances to different mines in Kankotri, just like him with his cart and many others. Carts were pushed to the center of the pit, where there was a huge elevator that had two functions, lifting the load and returning the workers to the barracks at night. Just like Izuku, there were many other boys in the mines, although very few like him, people without singularity. Most of them were people with short-range singularities, such as levitating things at a distance of 30 centimeters, being able to light a single finger on fire, seeing in the dark, or being phosphorescent. The people in the mines were the outcasts of society, the people who, as the Emperor said, only represent a shame to the evolution of Superman. The mines were God's punishment for not being strong. Midoriya smiled sadly at that thought. It was true, he had never been strong. At the age of 5, when she was supposed to awaken his singularity, it never arrived. His worried mother took him to the doctor, where she was told that Midoriya Izuku would never awaken. At first, the shock of the news impacted his family too much. His mother blamed herself, and his father. Well, Izuku did not have a father. His mother had had him very young, and had never mentioned anything to little Midoriya about the man who was supposed to have given him life. Despite everything, Izuku lived relatively peacefully for a few years. Although at school he was bullied by children with peculiarities, especially by Katsuki Bakugo, who years later would become one of his jailers, and the guard who would make his life hell, he was happy at that time. However, as was said, despite everything, Midoriya Izuku enjoyed his life until he was 8 years old, when the class law was enacted and forced all those considered socially weak to go to work in the mines. Midoriya remembered his life before the mine with his mother as a bright and warm time, a place before the darkness, the cold, the forced labor, and all the pain he had suffered. He had been separated from his mother suddenly. One day the National Guard had entered the house by force. A group of men dressed in black entered Izuku's room. The guard, as the men of order designated by the Emperor had been called, they were nothing other than former villains and people with powers that could serve to intimidate and abuse people. All of them used their power for their benefit, in many cases, killing and stealing in the name of the law. At first, and only time, Izuku encountered a group of men who treated him like an animal. Not only had they broken the door and beaten his mother to get in, but they looked for a little Midoriya until he found him, who they dragged out from under his bed, and then he was beaten for opposing the law. That was a perfect image of the new order of All for One, a group of men beating a child for being different. Midoriya Izuku's last memory of her mother was of an unconscious woman on the ground, with a small trickle of blood dripping from her forehead. Izuku screamed as much as he could, asked for help, cried, and begged. But nothing worked. He was taken to a cell with many other people. Children, the elderly, young people, men, women, in short, all kinds of people. All of them are put in cells to be moved like animals, with the sole purpose of working in the mines. This is misery. Killer Croc's scream breaks Izuku out of his reverie. Sorry, Izuku managed to whisper as he lowered his head and turned his gaze anywhere except at the humanoid crocodile, who was checking how much the day's production had been. You feel it, Killer Croc answered with a venomous tone. You'll feel it more, and with a movement of his tail he whipped Midoriya to the ground. Maybe if it were the first time Izuku would have screamed, but those blows were so common for him that he only covered his face with his arms to avoid blows to his face. Killer Croc's blows were only 5 and ended with an agitated humanoid. Maybe it was Izuku's imagination, but Killer Croc became increasingly agitated. Slowly, and feigning more pain than he felt, Midoriya stood before a smiling Killer Croc. Very well, trash, return to the group and don't expect much food or water at dinner. After saying that, the lizardman turned around and returned to the mine foreman's checkpoint. Midoriya stood up and returned with Work Team 13. Quickly, a white-haired woman with a few wrinkles on her face approached Midoriya to help him. "Are you okay?" Izuku. Killer Croc hit you very hard, you have broken something. The woman who helped him reach a chair was Yuki, a woman who had been separated from her family for having the only quality of making her nails grow 15 centimeters. During the years in the mine she had been a kind of substitute mother for all the children and young people. "Let him breathe, Yuki. Midoriya is the strongest young man I know," said an old man named Ren, whom Izuku always helped with his excavation equipment. Just like Midoriya, the old man had no singularity. Midoriya just smiled nervously at the old man and Yuki to say that he was fine. Soon all the work members of Team 13 surrounded Midoriya, some to see his condition, others worried about the food ration that night. After that they all waited for the excavation teams to retire to the barracks to wait for dinner. Although Midoriya had been in the mines for years, the truth was that he interacted with few people inside the barracks, some young people his age, and mostly the elderly, and women whom he helped. She preferred to spend her free time near the edge of the fence where she looked at the horizon and remembered her previous life. She thought about her mother, whether she was alive or in some mine. She had the ability to levitate objects, but Midoriya wondered if that uniqueness was enough to live in society. Also during those moments Izuku remembered the most surprising video he had ever seen about the greatest hero before the Emperor, the powerful All Might. As a child Midoriya had dreamed of being a hero like him, he imagined saving the world from the Emperor. With a smile, and with courage. But that had been just that, a children's dream. Izuku's reality was different and, as he went with the rest of the people from the mine to the dining room, he mentally reminded himself that he should not forget her. He was a mine worker, a simple boy without singularity, a coward who would never reach to be a hero. Not far from the mine where Midoriya worked, on a mountain a few kilometers away, 4 shadows observed the mining complex carefully. 3 shadows were medium-sized, barely larger than a child, for this reason it could be said that they were young. For slightly short adults, the 4th shadow was that of a somewhat tall man, however quite thin, since the coat he was wearing seemed to be too big for him. "Is that the place we will infiltrate, Shoto?" a girl's voice asked. "Yes," one of the 3 smallest shadows responded dryly, his voice seemed like that of a young man. "Don't worry, my pupils, if something happens." Cough cough. The man's voice was deep, although the coughing spell was so strong that the man had to crouch down and stop his speech. One of the shadows approached and patted him on the back for a few minutes until he was able to calm down and continue. "Bracia Ochako now, Todoroki and Nero will enter through the side door, which according to the informant is unguarded. Well, Ochako and I entered through the top of the dome and created the escape route. This time the coughing fit did not come and the 3 small shadows nodded slowly. In the end another girl's voice echoed in the darkness as the group separated. "Good luck Uraraka, and you too All Might." As Midoriya imagined, Killer Croc reduced the food ration almost by half. Many of the mine workers showed their annoyance, but the commotion was instantly extinguished by a series of explosions courtesy of Bakugo, in addition to a series of demonstrations of different singularities of the guards. Some with strength and reinforcement singularities hit the walls, those with humanoid appearance roared, and a couple of guards with elemental singularities showed off their skills by singing and beating a couple of workers. In the end, Killer Croc's roar from a box in the cafeteria silenced the guards and workers and plunged everything back into a fearful calm. Some time ago the people at the mine had opened up quietly and shown their resentment in silence. However, the silence of that moment was not just one of fear. Everyone had learned to fear the guards and Killer Croc. They had lost hope in the heroes or in someone who would save them from that torture. Even Izuku thought sadly that this was his destiny. In the end, dinner only left more hunger and sadness. Once in the workers' barracks, everyone proceeded to their only time of day where they could interact with other work groups, the 2 hours that the guards gave after dinner before turning off the lights. Many of the people looked for friends and acquaintances from other groups, talked about their day. Played cards or a game smuggled by the guards with someone, and tried to forget about life in the mine for a few moments. There were also people who formed intimate ties with other workers, that is, they sought to form a type of social relationship similar to courtship or marriage. The older and more daring people got together or slept in the same hut as one of the 2. Of course they talked to the other people in the selected place, and if they agreed the change was made, in terms of official approval, the mine rules said nothing about relationships in them. There were even young people Izuku's age who performed it. Midoriya was not very sociable, however recently a girl from Work Team 12 had approached him and proposed a relationship. The scene had been funny. The girl, who looked like a gorilla and was a head taller than Midoriya, had appeared after dinner with a letter in her hands. She had very righteously offered it to Midoriya with the words, "Please do me the honor of your partner of hers." Surprised and embarrassed, Izuku, in the middle of a group of curious people with attitudes that ranged between pity and mockery, found no better option than to flee the place as quickly as possible. To hide in the only safe place for him. The ceiling of the last bedroom of the barracks is 13. She was able to hide and continued doing so for approximately 3 months since the girl did not stop insisting on an answer. Apparently he was the one carrying the production car just like Midoriya, and it was there where she had seen her and fell in love with him. It was impossible for Izuku to accept something like what that girl said, since it would be accepting the reality of living in the mine. Furthermore, the girl scared him, and Izuku didn't know anything about girls in general, so he chose to escape every time. Later that was his special place and tried to go unnoticed. That day when they reduced the rations, Midoriya didn't know it, but everything would change. That afternoon he had watched the sunset and stayed there after the lights went out. The guards never searched the roofs of the barracks, only the lower parts. I guess they believed that the people in the mine were like cockroaches and being in the upper parts was unlikely for them. That night everything was calm. Midoriya was beginning to feel the cold and was going to enter her ratchet when she detected a subtle movement at the top of the dome. A strange object was sliding in the night sky. At first I imagined it was a bird, but I discarded the idea instantly. Midoriya knew birds, their shape, the way they slid, and that was not a bird, it was a round object, and in a burst of disbelief, he could only think UFOs and feel enormous curiosity. Almost instantly Midoriya came down from the ceiling and looked for a way to see that object up close. It might sound stupid, but that was at that moment the only thing Izuku wanted. As a child he had dreamed of aliens, and although life in the mine sucked, being able to see something this amazing would be incredible. Silently, he slipped through the darkest corners of the barracks, taking care not to let the guard see him. Still nervous and clenching his jaw because of what he was doing, Midoriya slipped out of the barracks, taking the center of the room as a reference. Dome of the mine, crossing paths with some guards whom I avoid by slipping into some corners of the road. Izuku reached the dome where the entrance to the mine was. He searched the sky for the UFO, but did not find it, regretting having been foolish enough to approach it. Midoriya was about to return when an explosion in the mine surprised him. At the top of the mine, the light coming from the explosion below illuminated 2 figures that Midoriya could see. Then everything seemed to fall into place. Izuku had not seen a UFO, it was something else. They were people, heroes who attacked the mine. The logical path would have been to run to the barracks, but, as the alarm sounded and the guard towers lit up, Izuku made the decision not to run, and even though he was afraid and not knowing that he was guiding him, he decided to stay and observe. Crouched between a couple of containers, Midoriya watched the guards run. Hurry up! An explosion in the mine warehouse. Guard units run to the southwest exits. Attack unit with me. The voice of the head guards and Killer Croc echoed overhead. Midoriya understood that if they sent squads to the southwest entrance it was because it was closer to the mine warehouse, but he knew that they would come out from there, but from the central part of the dome. There must have been a distraction that Izuku could have done to help those strangers. Izuku quickly slipped to the explosives warehouse that the guards were guarding, and luckily there was no one there. He took a couple of explosives and hid in between the shadows and the screams that they were not only the guards, but also the mine workers who, taking advantage of the tumult, were mixing among the guards. Some forced to put out the flames of the mine that had already spread to various parts of the mine, others starting fights with guards, although in Izuku's mind there was only one idea, to blow up the communication tower. The guards communicate by transmitters, and that would give them an advantage to whoever had started all that. Taking care not to be seen, Midoriya threw a couple of explosives at the base of the tower, trying to avoid thinking that someone could be harmed by that. He detonated the explosives and knocked down the tower. Soon everything was chaos. The barracks had also started to catch fire. There were explosions everywhere. Being certain that it would be enough, Izuku ran towards the barracks of 13, hoping that everyone was okay. However, he had not advanced 100 meters when he heard a voice that was very familiar. "Stop, there's a damn bitch." Izuku knew that voice very well. It was Bakugo, and the sound of explosions that accompanied it was confirmation. Stopping in the corner of an addition that had not been set on fire, Midoriya could see how a girl with straight dark hair was being chased by Katsuki. She was not dressed like those from the mine, but rather she was wearing a dark blue suit with several pockets and a backpack at the end of which you could see the sheath of a katana that the girl was carrying in her arms. However, he seemed to be powerless against Bakugo, who, in addition to his usual guard suit, had 2 special gloves on his hands that seemed to increase the power of his explosions. The girl reached a dead end, then Bakugo smiled madly, while the girl trembled holding her katana with both hands. "You and your friends will pay for it," Bakugo whispered, containing his hatred and in a venomous tone. However, before he caused another explosion, Izuku came out of hiding and screamed, "Hyuka-chan." Midoriya knew that would make him angry. The old nickname from both of their forgotten childhoods provoked the anger of the explosive boy who turned around ready to make Izuku explode. "Deku." However, Midoriya went ahead, using the last explosive. Izuku threw the load of TNT into Bakugo's hands, and it was impossible to stop Bakugo's gaze, which went from anger to fear when looking at the artifact. The explosion of the TNT and Kitsuki's singularity was enormous, launching Midoriya and the girl after Bakugo. A few meters back. A little dazed and sore from hitting a wall, Midoriya opened his eyes and looked horrified at Bakugo, who was in a crater, although with fear and concern Izuku ran towards him thinking, oh god, I killed him. Ah-chan with tears in his eyes, Midoriya looked at Kitsuki's body. His suit had several burns all over his body, his hair had been singed, there was an ugly burn on his right cheek, but the worst thing was his arms. Bakugo's arms were completely burned by the explosion, he still had both hands, but he no longer had nails, and they were charred black. Bakugo did not react, and for a moment Izuku thought he was dead. However, a thin hand rested on Bakugo's neck and then on Izuku's shoulder and said in a reassuring whisper, "He's still alive." For the first time Izuku looked at the face of the girl Bakugo was chasing. She had deep violet eyes, a small nose, and a pink mouth. Her dark blue bangs hid her eyebrows that were slightly raised in a worried gesture that was dedicated to a crying Midoriya. "Seriously?" he whispered. "Yes," she answered, "it's serious, his injury seems serious, but he will live, thank you for saving me." That calmed Izuku, who was still crying. It was true that Bakugo made his life hell, but it wasn't like he wanted to see him dead. Slowly Izuku left Bakugo's body, who was now beginning to move his chest slowly. "Come on, we have to get out of here." The girl's voice took Izuku out of his thoughts, and then the girl's hands pulled him away from Bakugo's body and led him through the burning building towards somewhere in the mine. There were still screams and sounds of explosions in the surroundings, but Midoriya only thought about what he had done. He had almost killed Bakugo, he had thrown an explosive at a person without thinking about it. She had hurt someone, and if the bullfall had also hurt someone, Midoriya realized that all of that made no sense. Everyone was being hurt, the people from the mine, the guards, and everything for what or why. However, before reaching an answer, and even with that girl being guided, and while they were running, a loud roar and formidable blow of a kind of whip sent Izuku and the girl to fly. In front of them was Killer Croc with a torn uniform and completely out of his mind, screaming and hitting everything in his path. Izuku stood up quickly, coming to his senses and realizing the danger. He turned towards the girl to flee, only to find himself she realizes that she was fainted. At that moment Killer Croc launched another blow towards the girl, moved only by the idea of protecting her. Midoriya rushed towards the girl, covering her from the lizardman's tail, however that monster did not stop and continued hitting Izuku. Midoriya was losing consciousness, he no longer wanted to see that, he didn't want to see people in the mine suffering, he didn't want to see guards, neither hurting others, nor being hurt like Bakugo. He wanted to be strong, protect them all, end that, he wanted to be strong, protect everyone, end the pain. Suddenly, Killer Croc stopped, half lucid, he shouted a bestial scream at Midoriya, as if to tell him to get off. But Izuku wouldn't do it. Slowly, with his whole body hurt and sore, with teary eyes, and biting her lip, Midoriya got up. "No, I won't move. I will protect this girl, and everyone." Izuku's words, although weak, were clear. However, fatigue overcame him, and he fell to the ground. Killer Croc's roar was louder, and Midoriya thought that everything would be over. However, a gust of wind and a violent roar made Midoriya look up. In front of him Killer Croc was unconscious, a huge man with spiky hair had hit him, he was wearing a huge dark green coat. Suddenly the man laughed loudly, he looked towards Midoriya, who saw dark eyes under huge blonde eyebrows. That man had a huge smile full of confidence. "Well done, my boy, rest." Those were the last words Izuku heard before fainting, but not before recognizing the giant in front of him. To the last hero in the world. The old symbol of peace. All Might. Midoriya was running down a dark hallway, he was afraid, he knew what was in front of him was something horrible. But what was behind him was worse, or so she felt. The light at the end of the hallway became brighter and brighter every moment, but the closer it got, the more the fear within Izuku disappeared. With his fists clenched, and a few meters from the light, Midoriya's fear had disappeared and was replaced by hatred, whatever was in that illuminated room. Izuku was going to kill her, he must have killed her. Midoriya woke up suddenly. It had just been a dream, agitated, as if he had run a lot. Izuku realized that he was in a strange place, it wasn't the barracks or anywhere in the mine. He was in a room with white walls, there were several beds, but all empty. At first Midoriya thought she was alone, however she realized that next to her bed in a small white armchair, there was a sleeping girl. Although he didn't recognize her instantly, Izuku realized that that girl was none other than the same one he had saved from Bakugo and Killer Croc, and who had apparently saved him by taking him to that kind of hospital. However, where Midoriya was, what hospital at that time would help a person without a singularity? Izuku was about to shout to ask someone where he was when the girl on the couch moved, shaggy blue hair and half-closed violet eyes turning towards Midoriya. "Good morning," I whisper in a sleepy tone. Midoriya blushed a little because of the naturalness of that girl. Boo boo, good day morning, he managed to answer and finally lowered his head. The girl opened her eyes wide awake. How are you feeling? He asked more seriously, looking at Midoriya in a very intense way. Midoriya put his hands on his face that had already acquired a red tone. That girl was very pretty and it worried him. Bye again. The girl sighed in relief and smiled before extending her hand and introducing herself. How cool, I'm Nero Tachibana. Izuku Midoriya, he introduced himself, still blushing. Where am I? He asked after a few seconds of silence. The girl was left thinking with her hand under her chin. You could say that at the base of the resistance, she answered at the end. It took Izuku a few seconds to process that. The resistance, he whispered in surprise, looking at the girl's face. Yes, she answered with a smile, which caused another blush from Midoriya. He was about to ask more when the door to the room opened and two people walked in. One was a middle-aged man with glasses, graying black hair and a doctor's coat, while the other person was a boy perhaps of Midoriya's age, but a little taller. He wore a dark blue suit with white military boots and gloves, on his chest, a protector with several compartments. But what caught the young man's attention the most were two things: one, his hair that was half white and half red, two, the scar on the left side of his face, which, added to his intense gaze, caused great intimidation. Shoto, Dr. Ryu, good morning, Nero greeted, getting up from his chair. The boy, who was apparently called Shoto, shook his head although he did not speak. The doctor on the other hand smiled and approached Midoriya. How is the patient? He asked calmly. Good, Izuku answered as the doctor took his pulse. Very well, he whispered. He had several injuries on his back and some broken bones, as well as minor burns, but thank God, nothing serious. The doctor smiled as he helped Midoriya sit on the bed. Nero and the others, they say that you are a hero, that you saved her twice in the mine. Midoriya blushed and lowered his head. He did not feel like a hero. He had hurt Bakugo, and with Killer Croc he had only served as a shield. He was not a hero. He did not have the strength or courage. No, I didn't do anything, he whispered. But Nero's hand on Izuku's made him turn around in surprise to see her. Yes, you did, she insisted with a smile and slightly blushing. If it weren't for you, that explosive boy would have blown me into pieces. Plus, when I fainted, it was you who protected me from the crocodile man. The girl's look made something inside Midoriya stir. He had never seen him like this, with a look full of gratitude and trust. You see, boy, you are a hero for Nero, and for others too, confirmed Dr. Ryu with a calm smile, trying to comfort Izuku. Behind him, Shoto looked at Midoriya with expectation. This was the boy who had saved Nero, and that All Might insisted on taking to the base. He didn't seem to have what it took to be part of them, his nervous look and that blush when Nero spoke to him. For Todoroki, he was just an ordinary boy. Although it was true he had endured a beating. But that didn't make it special. Midoriya was talking a little with the doctor and Nero, who told him that he was in a safe compound from the resistance. After Izuku had fainted, the reinforcements had arrived. All the people had been taken out of the mine. The guards had escaped when they saw that they were outnumbered. Midoriya smiled calmly. Everyone was fine, what a relief, but because there was only him there. Because there were no other wounded in the beds, it was not possible that he was the most injured. All that fire and explosions. And, as if his mind were read, Nero was the one who answered. You are here because there is someone who wants to talk to you. Nero's look was a little strange. Midoriya couldn't know if it was pity or what meaning it had. However, first you have to recover. The smile instantly returned. The calm of the girl behind her, the doctor also insisted and just smiled. That comforted Midoriya, who relaxed and thought that whatever was coming wouldn't be bad. In another room of the complex, a group of men and women were talking. The room was dark, only silhouettes were visible. The one speaking was that of a skinny and slightly bent man. I think the boy should stay here. The voice was deep but firm. You already have the girl. Why do you want someone else? The voice that answered was shrill and came from a small being whose shadow looked more like that of an animal than that of a human. Nero, the thin man, whispered. She is well. She is a great soldier. Her training, her fighting methods are very good, but she is missing something. Shoto claims that in the mine, she lost her cool with the fire. It is true that the girl has not tolerated him since the fire where her parents died, but similar scenarios will come in the future. We cannot risk him losing his cool at those times. The room was silent. No one spoke or replied. Everyone seemed to meditate on the man's response. All Might, the thin man, turned to look at the voice that had said his name. What is the possibility of using Todoroki? The thin man, All Might, remained thoughtful, put his hand on his chin, and searched for the words to answer about that possibility. Todoroki is strong, and his sense of justice far surpasses Endeavor's, but One for All has never merged with a singularity as strong as his. I don't know what would happen. Maybe his singularity would mutate or disappear. Silence reigned in the room again. This time it was as if everyone was thinking about what to do. It wasn't until an elderly man spoke that the silence was broken. What would be the function of the new boy All Might? All Might take a few seconds to answer. The green-haired boy, well, I want to train him and see the possibility that he, and not Nero, will inherit One for All. That surprised many, some instantly denied, thinking that too much had been invested in the girl or that idea was very arbitrary on All Might's part. However, he continued his speech. Look at that boy facing the crocodile man without hesitation, even knowing that he could die. He protected Nero with his body a stranger. He can endure much more than many people with singularity and stood up. That boy has the will, only he needs strength, and he will be able to make All for One grow. Everyone remained silent. That could be true. The heir project was not just looking for someone to stop the emperor, it was looking to create a new hero who would restore hope to everyone. Nero was the perfect candidate, skilled, brave, and with a good capacity for analysis, although only in training. In the real world it was different. Nero had a tendency to fail. He constantly despaired, doubted his actions, and made mistakes that more than once almost ruined the mission. The debate over taking the boy from the mine was longer than All Might imagined. Many did not agree with taking the boy as the future heir of One for All. Others accepted that Nero had made mistakes, but there was a candidate program, why not choose someone from there? The finals allowed All Might to have a 3-month trial. If it worked, the boy could be the heir. If not, the council would decide the new candidate. All Might came out of the room. He was wearing a white shirt and ripped jeans. He was smiling. He had accepted the boy. If his instincts did not fail, that boy had what it took to be the new possessor of One for All. He would be the new pillar of peace and the one who would finally defeat All for One. Ochako Uraraka had been born with the ability to manipulate the gravity of objects, making them light in order to make them float. She was born in a humble family. Her parents worked in the construction industry using her unique qualities. However, when the emperor promulgated the class law, everything was worse for them and for many more people with common but useful singularities. Uraraka's parents and many others were forced to work harder to build the new Japan. Labor was scarce. All those people who were taken to the mines left a hole in the economy. That is why those with useful singularities were exploited to the maximum. The Tokyo that had been destroyed had to be rebuilt. The looks of his parents, their smiles, his gentle voices, and those hospital beds where his lifeless hands fell were recorded in Uraraka's memory. Without family, Ochako had been left on the street. The emperor did not want the economy to be burdened with orphans. There was neither insurance nor an institution to help Ochako or anyone else. Without food or shelter, that little girl had rolled through the cold world, stolen to survive. She had seen everything horrible that society hid. And when she had been on the verge of dying at the age of 9, the hand of a boy had saved her from death. Now 5 years later, being a member of the resistance and one of All Might's disciples, she watched as that boy ran on the training track with that stupid face of effort. Uraraka was in the stands looking at the new recruit Midoriya Izuku. When Nero Tachibana told her about him, she had expected to see another kind of boy, someone who didn't seem so pathetic, but anyway, Nero always exaggerated after all. Ochako puffed out her cheeks. It had been a lie, that boy wasn't prettier than Shoto. Then suddenly he let the air out of his cheeks in a loud sigh. Well, no one was cuter than Shoto. At that thought, Uraraka blushed and smiled. If Todoroki was very handsome, tall, strong, brave, he was so serious, and his hard gaze made Ochako burn more than the flames that the young man produced. She was so caught up in her thoughts that she didn't notice a green-haired man who was observing her with great curiosity from the dance floor. Midoriya was doing what he had been asked to do, basic conditioning. In that base he only spoke with Nero and Dr. Ryu. But according to them, it was important that he was in the best condition. For what, he didn't know. However, now he was intrigued by the girl in the stands. She was leaning on the railing with her arms hanging. Her gaze was lost in a distant horizon. There was a huge blush on her cheeks and the silliest smile Izuku had ever had seen. He could have laughed, but before that the girl noticed that he was looking at her, and her face and her position on the railing changed drastically. She stood up quickly with her back straight, with an embarrassed look that lasted only a few seconds, only to give way to an angry one to scream. "What a time, idiot," while pointing his finger at Midoriya. And although it was more than obvious that Izuku was looking at her, given that they were the only ones in her place, but a little embarrassed and afraid, he could only answer the brunette with a lift of his shoulders. Ochako puffed out her cheeks in frustration, turned around, and left a perplexed Midoriya who had not fully understood that first meeting. However, he still had 10 laps to go around the track, so feeling his feet die, Izuku continued running. Far from the training area where Izuku was, in a small room, 2 people were having a vitally important talk about the green-haired man's future. It will have to be like this, All Might has just explained to Nero the council's decision to accept Midoriya, although, of course, they couldn't tell him. First he would have to pass basic training and a special exam, then only then would All Might reveal to Izuku that he would become the heir to One for All. I understand, Sir. Nero clenched his fists. He liked Midoriya and agreed with All Might's decision, but she felt frustrated. She had given everything to be the candidate for One for All, however she had failed in her revenge. Against the Emperor, and that promise to his parents. Don't worry, Nero, you are part of my team, and you will always be, however you said it yourself once. There is a doubt in your heart when you are on the battlefield. Maybe it is for the best. All Might tried to console the girl. It was true that she could see that she had been perfect, but that doubt she felt when fighting would break the will of the One for All, if she became its bearer. Nero smiled in defeat. All Might was right. I do believe that what you say is true, Master. Nero stood up and walked towards the door after bowing to the old symbol of peace. All Might remained restless, thoughtful. She worried about Nero. She was a strong girl, and her conviction of revenge had gotten her far, but in the future it could be a problem. What if he couldn't get over the fact that someone else was the one to stop the Emperor? All Might shifted restlessly in the armchair he had been sitting on. He rested his head on his arms and reflected on the future and what awaited them. Midoriya walked to his room. He had recently been moved from the infirmary to a specific room. On the way there he always met people, however rarely did anyone pay attention to him. Apparently everyone was more interested in other things. Well, after all, that place was a resistance base. Many were just passing through, and the others were in the communal area, while Izuku was a restricted area for many, made for troops in training, only there were no troops in that base. The base of the resistance in which Izuku was located was among some mountains. It was undetectable because it had been camouflaged with enormous walls that resembled the relief of the mountain, as well as a barrier of micro screens in the sky that prevented it from being seen from the air. The base had been intended many years ago as a training site for the destroyed UA Academy. Midoriya took a shower. His body felt burning, but he wanted to freshen up before going to the cafeteria area. In the place, like other times, it was an old woman who served him the food with a smile, just like the previous days since he had left the infirmary. Apparently she was mute, so Izuku just thanked him with a gesture and went to an unoccupied table, without, however. Halfway there he noticed the same brown girl who had been watching him while he was running. She was alone at a table, eating a bowl of ramen with a big smile. To Izuku she seemed cuter now than she had been a while ago. He thought about going to eat with her, but the very idea made Midoriya blush, so he preferred to pass by and eat alone. As Izuku walked to his table, Uraraka looked up from her bowl, and their eyes met. Then the brunette's sweet gaze hardened into an angry gesture that made it clear that she was still upset that Midoriya had seen him at that moment. Weakness. That look was more than Izuku could bear, so, as quickly as his legs would allow him, he moved to a seat where he began to eat without looking up for fear of meeting the gaze of a certain brunette. He hadn't been eating even 5 minutes when he felt someone sit down in front of him. At first he felt afraid, perhaps it had been the brunette who wanted to call him out on whatever he had done. But when he looked up he found violet eyes and the smile of a blue-haired girl. "Hello," Midoriya whispered, surprised by Nero, who laughed and rested his face in his hands, still looking amusedly at Izuku. "Hello, Deku." Since he had woken up in the infirmary, the girl insisted on calling him so that, apparently, she remembered Bakugo's words. However, now that the brunette said that nickname, she didn't feel like it was an insult, it seemed more like some kind of something. "How do you feel?" asked the girl who was still making fun of the green-haired boy's blush. "Well," Izuku whispered, "a little tired from training, but I'm fine. I like this place." Midoriya smiled as he looked down at his plate and continued eating. "I'm glad," Nero answered. "They say you train diligently." "That's good." After that the girl remained silent, her gaze darkened a little, and that worried Midoriya. It could be that the next thing would be something bad. What if they took him off the base? Even though Izuku gathered his courage and asked, "Is something wrong, Nero?" The girl looked at him for a few seconds. It was as if she had come back from very far away, but little by little she recovered her usual look, and with a smile she shook her head. "No, everything is fine, but there is someone who wants to meet you." That took a few minutes for Midoriya to process. Her face must have been quite funny, as Nero burst out laughing again. But before Izuku could ask who the girl was, he stood up, and with a quick wave he headed to the cafeteria door, leaving Midoriya still perplexed. The fire burned their home, the screams of people in fear, and a long, cold, almost inhuman laugh. At Nero's feet, the lifeless body of his mother. They had cut his throat. His eyes were empty, without pain, without happiness, without fear, without life. In them they only reflected one thing, the dead hand. She couldn't run, she was afraid. In front of her a huge man was holding her father by the neck. She couldn't see his face, only a silhouette. Her father begged, implored for his daughter, said that she didn't know the secret and that she was not guilty of anything, but the man never spoke. He only laughed again and then pierced her father's body with his own hand. Nero cried. She wanted to run to her father, but she couldn't. She could never reach him. The fire surrounded her, and the last thing she heard was a voice saying, "With you dies the secret of my all for one." Nero woke up covered in sweat and disoriented. That had not been a simple dream, it was a memory that she returned to every time. She turned to look around her and realized that she was in an unfamiliar room. The first thing Nero Tachibana did was look for her katana, which she found next to her bed. However, when she did, she looked at a brunette lying next to her. Ochako Uraraka was fast asleep, and Nero remembered that they were in a cabin at the training camp to help Midoriya. She sighed in relief and went back to bed. It was still very early, or perhaps too late at night, as she must have slept outside. But he couldn't, he only thought about the man who had killed his parents. He didn't remember his face, only his cold voice. The voice that after surviving he had heard on the radio in a speech by the Emperor. And although he could not be sure, Nero believed that it had been the Emperor who had killed his parents in person, but because the Emperor never appeared on television or in newspapers, and his photo had been erased from the Earth phase, he could not. Better, Nero decided to get up, he couldn't stay in bed anymore. He left the room that he had shared with Uraraka for a few days, and heard a strange sound outside the cabin. Slowly he slipped into the darkness, barely making a sound. Outside the moonlit cabin, Izuku was punching and kicking an invisible enemy, still wearing his dinner clothes, dark green pants, and a green harlot. His face was covered in sweat and contracted in that characteristic grimace of effort typical of the green-haired man. Nero smiled, Izuku was trying so hard. That camp was the green-haired man's test to be a carrier of One for All. Flashback. Nero accompanied Izuku through the corridors of the base. Finally, after being in that place for so long, he had finally allowed Midoriya to meet All Might and the reason why he was in that place. The young man walked nervously. As a child, that man had been his hero, but for years he had only been content to remember the good times, because Midoriya knew that All Might had lost against the Emperor and was dead, or so he assumed. The memory of the huge man and the explanations of Nero and some people in that place said that All Might himself had been the one who insisted on taking Izuku there. Nero looked at Midoriya, his lip was trembling, and he clenched his fists tightly trying to stay calm. He smiled amused, that expression on the young man's face meant that he was taking him seriously. Although he had only recently known the green-haired young man, he knew quite well what he thought. He was very transparent. He laughed again at that, and this time it caught Izuku's attention. WHWH what? He asked. Nero just smiled, slowly closed his violet eyes, and gave Midoriya a kiss on the cheek. Good luck just going in there, and before Izuku recovered he ran away, because that had been very painful for her, and he didn't want the young man to see the blush on her cheeks. Vindel flashback. Nero watched Izuku wipe the sweat from his forehead with the palm of his hand. He sighed and said something to himself that the girl couldn't hear. After that the boy sat on the floor to rest for a few moments. Nero didn't know what he had told All Might to Izuku or what the boy had told him. But when he left that room, it seemed that the young man's destiny had been to be the new bearer of One for All. That did not bother Nero. She knew from the beginning that she could not handle that burden. She had tried so hard, but in the end she had not succeeded, perhaps, as the higher-up said, she lacked character. And the proof of this was that Midoriya had to see the explosive boy. That time during the fight she and Todoroki had been doing well. She had defeated a couple of guards, however because of all the confusion, they had to separate and Nero ended up alone. The explosive boy had been her first enemy, and to her misfortune more than she could handle. If it hadn't been for Izuku, maybe she would be dead. She watched Midoriya get back up and start a routine. There was something about that boy that calmed her. Nero adjusted her hair behind her ear. She smiled looking at that green-haired boy, then she turned around and went back to sleep thinking about the green-haired boy. Midoriya sighed, he had to improve his technique. That camp was so that Midoriya would be a suitable carrier for All Might's One for All singularity. Midoriya sighed and relaxed his muscles. He had been chosen for that important task. Flashback. Nero had left Izuku alone at the door of the room where All Might was waiting for him. When Midoriya entered, he expected to see that huge muscular man that he remembered from his videos of yesteryear. But contrary to that, he found in an armchair a very thin, blonde man with a frightened grimace and quite deep black eyes. I have never understood why black, dressed in a yellow striped suit. Come on young Midoriya, and take away that stupid face. I am All Might, the real one. Izuku couldn't see the grimace he was making, but his eyes had opened in an exaggerated way, his arms had fallen to his sides. That man was seriously All Might, the old symbol of peace. For a few moments Midoriya went blank, but the thin and dark All Might gestured with his hand for her to take a seat in front of him. Child, I will be direct and tell you my story, and in that room All Might was honest with that until then unknown boy. He told him about his uniqueness and his origin, as well as his history with the man who had become the Emperor. Izuku only listened to that man and understood that he was the real All Might, that the wound in his side had almost cost him his life, and that society had freed him from him. Midoriya looked at that man. It was difficult to think that he was that smiling strong man, but now that Izuku knew life, he knew that hiding his fear behind a smile was only something a strong person could do. Now you understand, young Midoriya, it's time to pass my torch to a new symbol of peace. I thought you could do it." Izuku froze. To be honest, what could he do? After all, he didn't have any singularity. "Yeah, you, my young friend." All Might remembered how that boy had risked his life for Nero, but that had not been what had caught his attention, but his words. "Yes, you have the potential to be my successor." Izuku thought about it. That was a dream. It was his dream, the possibility of being a hero and having the greatest hero in the world be his mentor. But Midoriya now understood the world, that world. Cruel, dark, full of villains, where a boy's hope ends in the mines of Kankatri. "No," Midoriya whispered as he looked down at a very surprised All Might. "I'm not a hero, I have no singularity, I have no value, I'm just the boy from mine. How can I be the heir of all for one? There must be someone more capable." All Might was surprised. He believed that a young man without a singularity, who showed as much determination in whatever was asked of him as Izuku Midoriya, would accept that juicy offer. But Midoriya did not realize his potential. The mine had changed him. He didn't look at his heart and enormous courage in helping others, a courage he had shown with Nero and in helping with communications without being asked. All Might looked at that boy and couldn't stop thinking about the words he had said when facing Killer Croc. "No, I won't move, I will protect this girl and everyone." Midoriya had what it took. In a world of heroes, it was natural to protect others, but in a world of villains, in a place where hope and freedom have been lost, surviving changes everything. Revenge, fear, hatred, pain, force men to become what they fear and hate. But that boy had goodness in his heart. A rare gift, perhaps useless in that cruel reality, but with the power to change everything, if only he was fed and grew. "No, boy, you have what it takes." Midoriya looked at All Might in surprise. "You have the heart of a hero." Izuku opened his eyes in an exaggerated way, and some not so discreet tears appeared in them. "You could be the one. Symbol of peace, you can help everyone and change this world." Midoriya couldn't help but cry. He had waited a lifetime for someone to say those words to him. He had waited for his mother to say them, for anyone to say them. But in those moments it was All Might who said it. "Do want to save everyone. I don't want more people to die just for being different." Izuku, with clenched fists and tears in his eyes, wanted to believe that All Might was right and could be a hero, that he could inherit all for one and be a symbol. Peace. "Then young Midoriya became my pupil and became my apprentice." All Might extended his hand to Izuku, and the green-haired young man took it, hoping to become what that man wanted and not what his fears told him. Vindel flashback. Now Izuku was in those mountains training. He had less than 3 months to control and show that he was a worthy successor to All Might. And for that, in that place there was with Izuku and the others the special attack and infiltration team of the resistance, the Eraserhead team, led by Shota Izawa, one of the superheroes who had survived the Emperor. Next to the hero who suppressed the quirks was his pupil and members of his team, Ijiro Kirishima, the boy who could harden his skin and his body, who also had an amazing hand-to-hand fighting technique. Enki Kaminari, who possessed an electrification singularity, which thanks to a series of small discs and needles that he controlled using manual controllers, allowed him to attack the enemy from a distance. There was also Toru Hagakure, a girl with a unique invisibility quirk that was perfect for infiltrations. The three, despite being young, were elite soldiers within the ranks of the resistance. His mentor and team leader Eraserhead was a serious and methodical man in his work, contrary to his pupils who were quite happy and carefree. Or at least that's what it had seemed like to Izuku when they'd introduced themselves. Kirishima had red hair, somewhat pointy teeth, and a fierce look that reminded Midoriya a little of Bakugo's. However, unlike his, there was a certain warmth in Kirishima's eyes that matched the young man's affable character. Kaminari, on the other hand, was a good-looking guy, with blonde hair with a singular black streak in his hair and an amber gaze that resembled the mischievous and cunning gaze of a fox. The one who was a mystery was Toru, who could only be detected by her gloves and her boots. For everything else, only her voice gave her away. Izuku almost fainted when Nero and Toru herself told him that for the girl's quirk to work, she had to be naked. Young Izuku thought there was smoke coming out of his ears because of how blushing he had become. The function of those boys was to provide Izuku with training partners. With Kirishima he trained in hand-to-hand combat, with Kaminari dodging his attacks gave him agility, while with Toru trying to stop his invisible attacks sharpened his senses. Izuku. His training had 3 daily phases: exercise, combat, and use of tools. During the mornings he continued his physical conditioning, running in the mountains, using the gym and camp equipment, or on some occasions swimming against the current in the stream. That hadn't changed much, only now Kirishima and Kaminari used to accompany him. It was different being with those boys. They were so fresh and lively that they made Izuku feel a strange feeling of friendship. Of course, not only them, there were also the girls, Nero, Toru, and in a way that Midoriya didn't understand, Uraraka. Only the brunette was aggressive towards Izuku. He understood that she did not accept him as a partner or something else. Perhaps it was that in their first meeting the boy had seen a phase of the brunette that few had seen. So when talking to Midoriya he almost always seemed hostile, and when she looked at him he puffed out his cheeks and made a rude gesture at her and turned his face away. That puzzled Izuku, but with his new busy schedule, he had little time to think about it. But at that time, since he had started his combat training, Midoriya had not managed to win even once against Kirishima. The red-haired boy, despite being quite kind, was a beast at fighting. He did not have much compassion, although he did not reach the savagery of Bakugo. For Midoriya, who had never fought, that was difficult. Biting the dust again and again made him angry, so every night he practiced a little in the hope that the next day he could do a better job at training. "You're wasting your time, you fool," a voice from the cabin that caught Izuku's attention. It was none other than Uraraka who, even with a little sleep, looked at him from the porch of the cabin with her arms crossed and a look of boredom. Ito, excuse me. Midoriya was confused. He had understood very well what Uraraka was saying, but he didn't know why. "It's a waste of time," the brunette frowned in an obvious show of anger. "You will never be someone worthy of one for all." That surprised Midoriya. It was obvious that she didn't like him, but from then on she thought that about him. He wouldn't have imagined it. However, before she could reply anything, the brunette continued. "You're clumsy and cowardly. Nero says that you saved her, and for some reason All Might liked you. According to him you have a hidden potential or something, but to me it doesn't seem that way." Ochako walked around Izuku looking at him from top to bottom, judging him and evaluating it. "They say that you didn't help with communications in the mine which gave us time to get out, but I think you just wanted to escape." Nero said that the explosive boy yelled Deku at you. Izuku opened his eyes wide. Eyes, only Nero called him that, but Uraraka was reminding him of the truth of that nickname. "He says it sounds like he's trying hard, but the truth is that you're just a fool, right?" Izuku knew that all of that was true, but he couldn't give up in that place. All Might and Nero had faith in him. Maybe it was true before Deku meant dumb and useless. But now he was a new Deku, one who would manage to be a great hero and save everyone. Ochako looked at young Midoriya for a few moments. He was silent and looking at his hand. Maybe she had been too bad. But if it wasn't Nero who inherited One for All, the other person who could do it alone was Todoroki. Midoriya Izuku had to understand that and leave so that no one else would waste their time on him. "You're right," the green-haired man finally answered. Before, Deku meant stupid and useless. Izuku squeezed his hand tightly. But now it's different. Deku will no longer mean that he's a loser. Deku will be the name that gives him hope. To the others. Then Izuku's gaze met Ochako's. There was no longer any doubt on his face. Those trembling eyes were no longer there. His gaze was hard, sure, and for a few moments he paralyzed Uraraka, who felt a strong beat in his heart at the young man's determination. However, he couldn't reply as Izuku took the things from him and entered the cabin, passing Uraraka's side without speaking to her. Ochako heard him enter the men's room, and for a few moments he felt bad. He didn't believe that boy had a look or determination like that. In the end she herself returned to her room to try to fall asleep. Izuku spent the night thinking about Chako's words, and if he wasn't the right one for that responsibility, so far everyone seemed to support him, but there must also be people who thought that he wasn't the right one for that. Uraraka was one of those people, perhaps also Todoroki Shoto, whom he had not seen since his stay in the infirmary. Doubt flooded his heart. He was afraid, but now All Might could no longer stop. Nero and the Eraserhead team were supporting him, and no matter what the brunette said, he would move on and return that name that brings shame to his strength and the hope of others. It would be Deku, and it would mean to everyone try hard. Izuku rolled on the ground until he hit his back against one of the trees in that clearing they used as a training ground. However, almost instantly he got up and advanced towards Aridid, who was in a combat position. Kirishima had his hardening ability activated and both of his arms were like two steel tubes. Midoriya ran towards the Aridid and threw his left arm back as if preparing to throw a punch. Kirishima looked at that and prepared to receive the green-haired man's fist. However, in a fraction of a second Izuku changed his attack, turning to the left side and launching an accurate sweep towards the Aridid, who was unable to react and lost his balance when Izuku's right leg came into contact with his ankle. Izuku did not stop his spin after blocking the Aridid, but using his hands as he fell and taking advantage of his momentum, he launched a powerful kick with his right foot, seeking to use the talus to hit Kirishima's chest, who was confused and was barely able to protect himself. With such a blow that it echoed in the forest clearing with a dull noise. Midoriya, who felt as if his leg had collided with steel, threw his body to the side to spin across the ground and stand a considerable distance away. Kirishima stood up slowly. He was exhausted. Izuku had come a long way in a short time. That fight was becoming too long, and the wear and tear of both of them was taking him to new terrain that had not been explored before. Attack. Kirishima shouted as he advanced towards Izuku to engage in another hand-to-hand combat. However, the green-haired man had already analyzed Kirishima's technique. He would surely start with a powerful punch or throwing his arm to hit him. Either of the two attacks would surely start with the right hand. So Midoriya looked for space before him, and his enemy took a step back to avoid the Retide's powerful hardened attack. First was Kirishima's attack from the right, then a kick also from the right. He would throw his fist again, hoping that his enemy's defense was already reducing its effectiveness. However, Midoriya would not risk receiving a blow. He had learned too much from the Retide's beatings, so the greenhead's strategy was to dodge, tire Kirishima, and attack forcefully. Not far from Midoriya and Kirishima, a brunette watched them. Although she refused to train with Izuku, Ochako was part of the almighty team and had to obey his orders, and one of them was to supervise the green-haired man at all times while watching how he dodged the blows. Kirishima, Uraraka could not deny that Midoriya was becoming too good. They had been training on that mountain for almost a month, and he was already capable of giving the Retide a decent fight, who when throwing a punch slipped, and, as I fell, he was hit by Kirishima's knee. Midoriya, who took advantage of that small slip of his opponent and with an accurate blow to the back of the head, knocked out his training partner. As Kirishima fell, he looked for a brief moment, and during that last conscious delirium he thought, "I lost." Midoriya fell to the ground and sighed, although first of course he checked Kirishima's vital signs and made sure he was okay. He looked at the sky and smiled. He had managed to defeat the red-haired young man, an action that was not as easy as anyone would think. That brought him closer to his goal. "Good job, young Midoriya." All Might's deep voice surprised Izuku, who stood up almost immediately and smiled nervously to show that he appreciated the compliment. The former symbol of peace was wearing worn jeans and a white shirt that was too big for him. "It was luck, I think," Midoriya answered, scratching the back of his neck. "Never." Izuku was startled a little since All Might had changed to his muscular form to emphasize his words. "What you just did is only the result of your effort." All Might crouched down a little and took Izuku's shoulder, and he gave him a thumbs up. "Now we have to take young Kirishima to receive treatment." All Might picked up Kirishima and took him to camp, while leaving Midoriya alone for a few minutes to reflect on his progress. The month of training had been complete hell. All Might's routines were not only extreme, but they put young Izuku to the test. Now he not only ran, lifted weights, and swam against the current. He had started with a training that consisted of climbing the mountain, which was quite complicated. Uraraka was tempted to go to the green-haired boy and talk to him. Since the night the girl had confronted Midoriya, he had not spoken to her, except for what was essential. Before, they did not talk much, but the green-haired boy used to look for some kind of deal among them. However, before he could take hold of his straight dark blue hair, he approached from one of the ends of the field where they had previously been fighting. Nero was getting very close to the green-haired man. Ochako saw them both smiling and decided to walk away without being seen. When she did so, she noticed a strange feeling awakening inside her. The two young men were sitting on the grass looking at the sky after Nero's arrival and a brief explanation from Midoriya about their fight. Both boys had remained silent. The truth was that Izuku really liked Nero. She was very pretty, and since she had arrived at the resistance base she had treated him very kindly. She could almost say that that girl was Izuku's first friend. "You've made a lot of effort," said Nero, still looking at the sky. "Yes, I think so, although I still have a long way to go to be worthy of one for all." Izuku also looked at the sky and reflected on the new life that awaited him. "Maybe you're right, but I know you'll make it." Nero looked askance at Izuku, who, still looking at the sky, showed reddened cheeks. Izuku thought that being next to that blue-haired girl always made his heart race. On the other hand, Nero found it relaxing to be with Izuku. He had not met another boy like that. Everyone around him had so much hatred against the Emperor. Everyone wanted to seek revenge or a great change, but almost no one thought about other people. The people from the cities or the mines of Kankotri. Midoriya had talked to him about his life in the mine, and although it was very sad, for some reason he smiled when he told him certain things, as if that had not been hell. It was as if he saw a kind of hope where Nero herself only saw sadness and pain. Midoriya had a way of seeing things that Nero knew deep inside her. That was part of the strength that All Might mentioned the new wielder of One for All possessed. "Let's walk," Nero suddenly said, breaking the green-haired young man out of his reverie. "I want to walk along the river." Midoriya smiled and stood up to follow Nero Tachibana, who was already on his way to the river. Very far from the training camp, in an imposing city full of buildings, cars, and people, a huge coliseum rises in the middle of imposing buildings. That place was the headquarters of the Emperor's Guard, the place where all the men in the service of the Emperor all for one trained, Vivian, and killed. In a large room with 2 rows of beds along the walls, a young blonde man sat looking at his bandaged hands. Bakugo looked at the result of his encounter with the resistance and the incident with Izuku. Midoriya The doctor had told him that the explosion of the dynamite and the explosion it had caused had injured him because of the boy's gloves, which were still a prototype. Apparently the boy's hands had been burned by the size of the explosion and the components of the TNT. The young blonde tried to close his hands, but it was impossible. He couldn't feel his fingers or palm. It was a strange cramp, the only thing the boy could feel. The healing quirks didn't work for some reason. It was as if his body itself Katsuki refused to recover. That was the end of the boy. Without his arms, using his singularity would be impossible. While he was meditating, he heard a great commotion in the hallways, guards walking from one side to the other. However, that did not matter to the boy. Surely he and all the guards would be executed for letting the slaves escape from the mine. Bakugo was deep in thought and did not notice when the large infirmary door opened and a man in a suit quickly entered and instantly closed it. The guy was tall, he had very white skin, however at that moment there were many red spots, perhaps due to tiredness from running. When Bakugo noticed it, he frowned. "Get out," he shouted to get the attention of the man, who had been glued to the door trying to hear what was happening. "Calm down, kid, I'm just hiding," the man answered without changing positions. This made the blonde boy very angry, who tried to take a pillow and throw it at him, but his hand didn't respond to the grip. "Hey idiot. This is an infirmary," Katsuki shouted again, trying to get the guy who wasn't dressed as a guard to leave. "If you don't leave, I'll shout for the dens." It was almost possible to hear Bakugo's teeth grinding in frustration. The man who had not changed his position at the end flipped and revealed his face. He had an oval face, small ears, dark green eyes, the same as his hair, which was short at the bottom and a little messy at the top, where it was longest. That face instantly brought Midoriya's face to Bakugo's mind. "Deku?" Bakugo whispered to himself. The man in front of the door smiled kindly. "Calm down, young friend, why don't we talk?" Bakugo looked suspiciously again at the man in front of whom I smiled in a somewhat silly way. It was true that at first it had reminded him of Deku, but now upon closer analysis, the man had much darker hair and his eyes were not green, but rather a deep black that had confused the boy with the explosions. The man, who was still smiling, made a sign with his hands for Bakugo to remain silent while he listened one last time for any noises behind the door. The man sighed in relief because everything seemed calm outside and walked towards Bakugo. It was at that moment when the young explosive realized that the man's clothes were not just any clothes, but that they were of high quality. Apparently that clown was an aristocrat from the all-for-one society. The man took the clipboard that was at the foot of Bakugo's bed and looked carefully at what it said. The explosive boy was still glaring at him, however he was no longer shouting. It was as if suddenly the atmosphere had changed when he had seen that man in the face. Bakugo felt his fury calm down little by little. "Why don't you leave?" He tried to insult the man, but even that it decreased in intensity. Perhaps it was the medicines that were beginning to take effect on his body. However, even though Bakugo's gaze was capable of making the toughest guards retreat, that man, after looking at his medical studies, looked at him in one way. A way that reminded him of Deku when he was a child. She looked at him with pity. "Don't look at me like that, old man," Bakugo shouted with all his might. Because the hell the doctors looked at him like that, because that man looked at him like that, because Deku did. Everyone was stupid, and Katsuki's angry grimace warped into an expression of intense frustration and fear. He didn't need the pity of all of them. He was Bakugo Katsuki. He was born to be someone great, someone as great as the All-for-One. After all, he was born as a genius. However, the man who was now next to his bed still looked at him with those eyes. And no matter how much Bakugo refused, he wouldn't change his gaze. Tired of it, Bakugo threw himself to the side of the bed, hiding from that look, from the stupid pity. He knew he was done for and would be a nobody like everyone else off guard. But he refused to do so. Perhaps that was his destiny to end up like this. Bakugo bit his upper lip trying to hide the pain from him and the tears that inevitably came from his eyes. The man left the clipboard on the bed and sat in a small visitor's chair. He looked at the boy's back and without him seeing it, a cold and chilling smile formed on his face. Suddenly his eyes that had been calm acquired a coldness that would have scared anyone. That boy was interesting. "I know what it feels like to know that you are made for great things and to be limited." Bakugo heard that. He really knew it. He thought it's a serious kid. "I know what it feels like to have all the power and have fate cut you off. Wings that he has given you." Bakugo listened to that carefully. "I know what causes people who are stupid and their stupid actions and ways of seeing life. I know how it feels to have an annoying stone in the way." Suddenly in Bakugo's head appeared the image of Midoriya Izuku. "But you know what you want most. You will never be able to take it if you don't have the resolve to do it." Bakugo thought that that man would continue talking, but when he said that, he fell silent and let Bakugo reflect what he had said. They were silent for a while. Bakugo didn't want to look at his face, and the man didn't speak for a while. In young Bakugo's mind there was an idea that was spinning around him. He would no longer be able to use his arms. Was that a truth, or was it just enough that he had the resolution to take what he wanted? The man stood up and walked towards the door. Before leaving alone, he said to Bakugo, "You must be present at the execution of the losers." Then he closed the door behind him. "1 more kilometer," Midoriya whispered as he hunched over a little to breathe. The race had been longer than he imagined. Little had she gotten used to his routine, however he had to increase it gradually. Taking a look behind him, he had gone a few kilometers from the camp, but if he ran with all his strength, in 5 minutes at most he could be there. He would run a little more, then he would return. The days at training camp were almost over. He had managed to defeat Kirishima. In addition, he was already able to stop and look for Hagakure, and it was becoming increasingly difficult for Kaminari to hit one of his electric attacks. The life he had led had changed very quickly. Trapped in the mine, he had believed that he was losing hope, but that was not true. Hope remained within him. He had felt it when he saw All Might and his team infiltrated, when he tried to save Nero. Maybe the world was in control of All for One, but he could try to change, at least him, Midoriya, Izuku, Deku. He could try to change it. Suddenly he turned to look at his back. In that place there was Deku's hope. In that place there was still All Might, Eraserhead, and his friends. Midoriya smiled. All those bad things that had happened to him as a child seemed to have led him to that place, and that was okay. Eraserhead looked at the thin Almighty, who was standing next to the window looking into the distance with his hands in his pockets. "Are you thinking about how much time you have left?" asked a serious man very directly, who took advantage of the calm of the room to refresh his eyes with his usual drops. All Might did not answer quickly. He took his time and pondered his friend's words. It was true that he thought about the time he had left, but that in Izuku, the boy admired him too much. He had realized this a long time ago. He followed each of All Might's suggestions immediately, and without Basil. That was fine. The boy had advanced more than anyone else in the 2.5 months they had been there, but All Might had to see the determination of the boy once again. "Boy. Yes, I think about time, and also the boy," I answered at the end when Eraserhead had almost given up. "What happens to him, Azawa? If I can't guide him, my time is ending." Tachibana was the one, but we never thought that she well, her body. "Don't talk about it, someone might hear it," Azawa warned in a rather authoritative tone, to which All Might waved his hand in apology and scratched his head while smiling sadly. It was true that this was not the place for that topic. "You're right. Getting back to the topic, what would happen if my guide was not enough for Midoriya? What would happen if I chose my successor wrong? The truth is that my decision was impulsive." All Might took a seat in front of Eraserhead, who looked at him, trying to interpret what was going on in the mind of the old symbol of peace. He was doubting his actions, and he had to help him. "I don't think Izuku was a bad choice. His choice is a lot like you. The times we live in have forced us to get here. Maybe the ideal candidate would have been Mirio, but he chose sacrifice, and the next generation would be the one to change this world." Almighty looked at Izawa for a few moments. The hero who erased the quirks never said anything unnecessary, and that was true. Mirio, his old pupil, had sacrificed himself for an opportunity for the future, and if he had chosen Izuku, he had to trust him, to put his hope in the same place that the deceased Lemillion had placed. "You're right, Azawa-san, the future is in the hands of these boys. It will be a very difficult road. The battles that await them will test everything in them." All Might stood in front of him and meditated for a few minutes on what he was thinking. "Have you made a decision?" Azawa asked as he leaned on the chair he was in. "Yes," All Might answered, still in the same position. "It will be tonight when I give the one for all to Midoriya Izuku, and he will become its 9th bearer." Azawa only insisted with his head while carefully observing All Might's face, who seemed more and more tired. Bakugo got up with the help of some nurses. They insisted that he must be in a wheelchair. However, with his now classic attitude, the boy sent them to hell and decided to go out to see the execution of the guards in charge of the mine. That was not something unusual. Those who failed All for One lost their lives. He walked slowly through the stone corridors where he met several guards and boys in red uniforms who were studying there. That enormous coliseum was also the academy for those who aspired to be guards. Bakugo himself had been there. He had been first in his class from the beginning, the best student, the best at fighting. That is why he had graduated early and had been sent to the Kankori mines. The academy had not changed, it had remained the same. Bakugo looked at some boys running. They must have been at most years old. He looked at him and Deku running in their old hometown when they dreamed of heroes. Heroes that didn't exist. He had chosen true power. The power he offered served the All for One. The corridors were getting smaller and a loud clatter of people could be heard at the end of the hallway, where a light hid what was happening in the Colosseum. When Bakugo came out of the rock hallway, he was blinded for a few seconds. Then he looked at all the stands of the Colosseum full of black and red suits, all shouting and booing. In the middle of the arena he had placed a pedestal, and on it, a series of posts made of special metal to suppress people's quirks. There were 7 guards, and they were all more than scared. The crowd didn't help much. Having the heads of those 7 rolling was better than theirs. Of the guards, the only one who continued with his head up and challenged everyone with shouts and insults was Killer Croc, who made the pole where he was held tremble with his enormous strength, and his reptilian appearance had always caused Bakugo to have deep respect. He was a strong and scary guy. All for One is dead. Killer Croc shouted, "We have not seen him in any execution, this is just something done by the higher-ups." Such expertise that the crocodile man was nervous despite the ferocity he wanted to show and wanted to urge the others to follow him in a rebellion. That was not new, many other guards whispered it in the mines, that All for One was dead and that what maintained that government was a few high-ranking officials. Bakugo smiled, as it seemed the guy he admired was more pathetic than he had ever thought. "Siblings, help me get rid of this, and let's take what belongs to us," the crocodile man continued shouting. Itsuki wondered if that could be true, he had never asked him. If the emperor was dead and all that was just a lie. She wondered if it was just okay in his hands that he would jump to help the old Killer Croc, or if, as at that moment, he would only feel sorry for him, disgusted by a fallen hero. For a brief moment he remembered his old hero All Might and that day when, as a child in front of the television, he watched his beloved hero fall before All for One. At the very least he lost all hope, and within him the despair of feeling weak was born. He remembered All Might being hit by that shadow that he could never focus well, a shadow that would become a legend, and Bakugo's new goal. Be like that man, strong to take everything, strong to destroy what he wanted, strong to never feel that someone has to protect you. Killer Croc was still shouting even in the crowd. The emperor does not. Silence. A thunderous voice silenced the rest of the Colosseum, the boss, the screams, even the noise of the city was silenced by that loud voice. In the box of honor a black curtain was drawn and showed a small group in it. There were 9 or 10 people of different sizes, all dressed in white uniforms. That was the elite of the elite, the emperor's guards. The most powerful men and women in the world today, many of them were not known because they had been selected by the emperor himself when he came to power, but there were some former heroes and former villains who could be identified. For example, the former hero number 2. Endeavor. Dressed in a white uniform that shone with his beard. There were others, but when Bakugo looked at the man next to Endeavor he couldn't think of anything else. He was dressed in black, which contrasted with the guards. He was not as tall as Endeavor, but he had a presence that contrasted with the others. His hair was a dark green that almost looked black, his skin was white, and his eyes were black. He smiled, but his smile chilled the blood. It was as if the aura he emitted intimidated everyone. "I am All for One. I am the emperor." Bakugo almost fainted. The man in the infirmary was the emperor. He was All for One. He was the one who had destroyed the hope of the world and defeated All Might. "A unit surround a special unit with me," a voice directed a group of men from somewhere in the leafy forest. In front of the men whose faces were hidden in the darkness were a series of cabins in the middle of the mountain that looked somewhat old. Those men were the emperor's guards. They were the murderers of freedom, the men who remained at the service of power and who therefore committed terrible crimes. The camp in front of them, according to the information, was the location of the last vestige of the All Might hero world. That mission was to eradicate it. The hero resistance might be gaining followers for its raids on the Kankori mines or its attacks on the cities furthest from the emperor's capital, but showing the old symbol of peace completely destroyed to the entire world would help maintain the people at bay. The person in charge of that operation was a tall man with brown hair and an age unknown to the guards in charge. He did not speak much. But he was a methodical and efficient man. He always wore a red leather mask similar to that of the doctors of the Inquisition, which gave him the appearance of a bird of prey, but what stood out most about him was a huge scar that ran across his face. Right eye, which he covered with a patch. That guy's name was Kai Chisaki, who was observing the operation from afar. Around him there were several men with communication quirks who were monitoring everything. Chisaki was angry that the operation was not to his liking. A guy like Kurogiri would be more suitable for that. His warp ability would make everything easy, however he was on another mission, and the emperor himself had assigned him that task. Just thinking about All for One made Chisaki tremble. He didn't serve him out of loyalty, but out of fear, just remembering his power and his fight. He had lost in a frightening way, including his eye, which despite his quirk, he had not been able to put back together. His boss was a careful guy, but he had spared his life, although of course in exchange for his loyalty and his research on quirks, thanks to that he was now a powerful guy, feared, and with the damn responsibility of missions like that one from time to time. From time to time. "Let the advance units be ready," Chisaki ordered. "I also want 2 containment squadrons 3 seconds behind at all possible elements in the air." "Yes, sir." Everyone answered. "Sir, the infrared units cannot penetrate the cabin, the radar is no use either, that is why we cannot guarantee the number of targets." Overhaul, which was Hisaki's code name, looked at everything around him for a few seconds. He had enough men to crush a small gorilla, however the man inside was All Might, he should not be underestimated. "Let everyone take action in 5," Chisaki ordered as he took off one of his white gloves and headed towards where in 1 second the world would burn. Boom. The explosion of one of the walls of the cabin shook everything. Men in red entered from all sides holding weapons. Some had several arms, others were enormous, and a few had shapes that could never be human. However, the silhouettes that were seen from the outside and the lights that moved turned out to be paper silhouettes. Surprise. A girl's voice sounded in the room, and a huge light appeared in the room, mowing down the men who had entered the room. Smash, SSS. The scream from below the floor preceded a roar before a huge current of air that broke the floor and the ceiling, sending everyone flying. From the hole formed in the ground, a floating rock emerged in which 3 people were found. One of them was impossible not to recognize. He was a huge blonde man who showed a huge smile that froze everyone present. The other was a man in black clothing who wore strange goggles and bandages around his neck like a scarf. He was the hero who erased Quirk's erasehead. The other was a boy with a strange rifle. "Fire units!" shouted one of the guards who had taken a few seconds to react. "Not so fast, friends." All Might shouted, who instantly attracted everyone's attention. Texas Smash. All Might's powerful fist sent half of those in the cabin flying, and the other half he threw on the ground. Almost instantly the heroes jumped from the rock to the cabin floor, which caused the rock to fall. Eraserhead instantly set about immobilizing every guard within reach. While the boy with the rifle, who was none other than Kaminari, began to shoot to make way. The guards kept arriving, and more black dots appeared in the sky that were nothing more than villains. A new blinding light appeared in the cabin, disconcerting the guards. The one who was creating those distractions was the invisible girl Hagakure, who after the second flash had been exhausted. For this reason she was clinging to Kaminari's shirt, who continued shooting at the guards. Aizawa knew that if they stayed in that position they wouldn't be able to last long. The number of enemies was overwhelming. They had to find a way to get away from there. Also, the further away they were, the more time they would give Midoriya and the others to escape from there. All Might looked at Aizawa. He had had too many missions together to not know what he thought, so before using an escape plan, he had to open more paths. Detroit Smash. All Might's fist this time went towards the ground, which caused a huge shock wave that sent everything flying, from the cabin, the guards, and even Kaminari, Hagakure, and Aizawa, although almost instantly the hero who runs quirks used his bandages to attract them to him. That was All Might's plan, to send everyone flying. In the air he would take Aizawa and the boys and use his power to direct himself away from the enemies. Almost as soon as everyone flew away, All Might caught Eraserhead in the air and instantly headed to the opposite side. New Hampshire Smash. His body to Aizawa, Hagakure, and Kirishima as they fall, seeking to lessen the blow. However, almost instantly on the ground beneath them, huge sprouts began to sprout, forcing All Might to launch another Texas Smash, which destroyed some of them and at least made the impact non-fatal. The cause of that had been Chisaki, who knew better than anyone that the men he had sent would not be enough for the old symbol of peace. Now while they were there the ground would capture them. Before handing them over to the emperor he wanted to experiment a little with them, especially with the guy who erased quirks. However, before he could get close, a lightning bolt almost hit him. That's when he noticed it. In the air there were strange little metallic umbrellas falling. Soon another lightning bolt tried to attack him. That's when he looked at it. The boy who is with All Might and Eraserhead had jumped before hitting the ground, and it was the one who was attacking him. The boy was dressed in black and had a strange short rifle in his hands, which from time to time, he pointed at an umbrella to fire another beam. Chisaki looked into his eyes as she looked for the best way to get rid of him. That's when he noticed it. His gaze showed no hesitation. It was the look of someone who had been in battle, harder than many of his guardians, and it was a shame because it would eventually kill him. He touched the tree next to him, thinking that with it he would pierce the boy's body, and that was when he noticed it. Eraserhead was standing. He had nullified his quirk, then in a split second a bolt of lightning hit him and left him stunned. He watched All Might and the others stood up and began to escape. He tried to use his quirk, but he was still under the hero's nullifying gaze. Guards began to emerge around him, whom he ordered to follow the fugitives. That humiliation would not remain like this. Chisaki walked while he felt rage flowing through him. He would kill them all, and before handing their deformed bodies to the emperor their blood would decorate his cells. While underground, 4 shadows were advancing through a narrow tunnel. Midoriya couldn't get All Might's order out of his head. He, Kirishima, Tachibana, and Uraraka had been ordered to escape, while the others drove the enemy away. Izuku just hoped that everything was fine. Behind them there was the sound of explosions and gunshots. It was more than obvious that the Empire had reached his hideout, that the All-for-One men were already after him. He looked askance at Kirishima. He was running like the others, but his face showed a certain concern. He was the only one of the Eraserhead squad who had escaped. He wanted to stay and fight with his teammates and his sensei, but now they had two to escape, and in case of a confrontation, Kirishima's strength was more than necessary. Uraraka and Tachibana were also worried about All Might. He was not able to maintain his muscular form for long now, but if anyone else stayed behind, the chances of getting out of that ambush unscathed were nil. Izuku knew that this was the rebellion's way of life, running away, fighting, and surviving. Now he was part of it, his quiet life at the rebellion base, and in the camp was over. Now he began his true work, as the bearer of the One for All. Izuku clenched his fists in frustration. He wanted to fight alongside All Might to prove his worth, but for now that was impossible. A loud explosion sounded behind the escaping boys, and a strange pressure felt in Izuku's heart. Far from there on the ground lay All Might. A black cloud was beginning to take on various shapes. A unit dressed in red had managed to catch the rebels. The man in front was wearing a waiter's suit, and his face was hidden by a strange darkness that swirled, had ambushed All Might. All according to the Emperor's plan. Everyone's gaze was on the Emperor, the powerful possessor of All for One, who was still looking at Killer Croc from his box. The old guard was being tried for the mine incident in front of all the other guards and cadets who were yelling and throwing objects at the crocodile man. "Please mercy, mighty Emperor." The lizardman shouted from the place where he was tied in the middle of the Colosseum. Bakugo felt some pity for the old lizard since, although Katsuki was young, he knew that the Emperor had no mercy on anyone. Least of all those who failed him. The Emperor still showed that cold smile. No one knew what those cold eyes were hiding. Perhaps he was considering the request for mercy, or, as everyone assumed, he was looking for the most horrible way to put an end to that man, whichever of the two things, a single movement of man dressed in black. The Emperor turned slightly towards Endeavor to say a few words. The enormous man of fire insisted, and instantly, to the astonishment of everyone, the Emperor jumped from the box and gracefully stood in front of Killer Croc. His voice sounded a little different than the one Bakugo had heard in the infirmary room. It was a little rougher and clear. She owed a certain feeling of respect and solemnity, and although she was far away for some, she was perfectly hearable throughout the Colosseum. Perhaps one of his auditory quirks transmitted it because it was as if the Emperor himself were in front of each person. "You are one of my faithful Killer Croc men." While the Emperor said this, he walked around the lizard man. "However, you have failed me." When he said the last thing, he stopped in front of Killer Croc, who only looked at the Emperor with fear, because despite begging, he would never have imagined that the supreme leader himself was in front of him. That opportunity was invaluable. She just had to convince him of his innocence. "My lord, but it was not my fault." The man who brought the old symbol of peace all, however, before he could finish, the Emperor covered his mouth with enormous force. The dark gaze of the possessor of the All for One, I froze the entire Colosseum. The beastman had said something forbidden. "Shut up." The Emperor's fury was such that he had released the air pressure in a single movement, creating a gust that had shaken the people of the Colosseum. A trash like you wouldn't dare to say his name. Killer Croc place, as fear invaded his being. Although the lizard man was taller than the Emperor, he had begun to feel small. "You are nothing more than a damn Kankori addict. Don't you think you didn't know it? When the damn rebels attacked, you were so doped that you were unable to think correctly. You are nothing more than a beast, and you deserve to die." Everyone in the school was silent. The fear was not just Killer Croc. Everyone felt that now of power and death that emanated from that man. With a quick movement, the Emperor grabbed Killer Croc by the neck, beginning to suffocate the lizardman, who could barely pull the chains, in an attempt to resist the force that was being exerted on him. However, before the crocodile man died, the Emperor he released his neck, causing the crocodile man to inhale forcefully the air he needed to not die, letting himself fall as far as the ropes and chains would allow him. The Emperor smiled evilly, looking at the crocodile man, and then looked at the crowd to speak a few words to them. "Look at this incompetent. This is what happens to those who fail me." The Emperor put his hand on Killer Croc's face, forcing him to look at him. Suddenly purple lines and small rays of purple energy began to surround the body of All for One. Killer Croc began to scream with all his might, while the small rays of energy also enveloped him. Suddenly something surprising began to happen. The scales of the lizard man's body began to fall. His head, which was like that of a crocodile, began to shrink. His entire body was changing. Everyone understood it. The Emperor took away his uniqueness. The process was quick, a matter of a minute. However, for all the spectators that was eternal. They witnessed the unique ability of the Emperor, the ability to seize power from others. In front of the Emperor, who had stopped smiling, was a thin man with what had been Killer Croc's clothes. His face was still looking at the Emperor. However, his gaze was lost and empty. His mouth was still open, but he was no longer emitting anything. The sound was now slowly filled with drool that was beginning to spill from his lips. The Emperor looked away from that man with a gesture of disgust. His voice returned to the beginning. The fury he had felt was beginning to fade, but the fear in the crowd of everyone in the Colosseum was not. All of you are my important legions of peace. You take my justice where I say it. You maintain order in my perfect society. But remember, those who fail me are not necessary. When the emperor finished saying those words, all trace the anger had faded from his face, and he now smiled kindly at everyone. However, it was that smile that chilled Bakugo's blood as he looked stunned at the strongest man in the world. Far from the Colosseum, a man dressed in a waiter's suit walked behind the bar of an old bar in a city. The man took a glass from time to time from under the bar and cleaned it with a white cloth. In the background, an old record player played music from the 80s. Suddenly the door opened and a young man dressed in blood red entered. He was quite tall, almost 1.80 meters. His uniform was impeccable, perfectly ironed and wrinkle-free. His gaze was stern behind square-framed glasses. The young man walked to the front of the bar, where he gave a martial salute to the man dressed as a waiter. Then stick out your chest in a standing position and give your information. Gurigiri-sensei, everything is ready, as ordered. The boy saluted again when he finished saying that. Gurigiri took his time to answer, so much so that the young man in front of him thought he hadn't heard him. However, after putting away the last glass that was on the bar, the man's yellow eyes focused on his subordinate. Perfect Ida-kun, let Yaoi Rozu, Tokoyami, Jiro, and Shoji know that we will be Chisaki's support to capture All Might. The end. Thanks for watching my video, and make sure to check out the author of this fanfic. Link is in the description. See you next time. Till then, sayonara.